goodbye, and the man who now had the nickname of Titanic dedicated himself completely to the life of a traveling gambler. In every town he visited, whether it be in a pool hall or finding a card or dice game in the back of one shop or another, he would always find some action. Wherever he went, then Titanic always found some place where he could ply his trade, but that wasn't the end of it by a long shot, as he was also constantly practicing and refining his art. He would focus on things like perfecting the mechanics of his dice throw so that they would skid more than they tumbled, thereby giving him somewhat more predictable and reliable results. This was apparently the way he approached everything when it came to his gambling. Titanic would practice everything he did religiously until he could reproduce seemingly random or rare feats at will. Basically, any skill he could use to lure people into making ill-advised bets was something he pursued and attempted to perfect. For example, he would practice doing things like reliably flicking cards from across the room to strike doorknobs or land into a hat. Then, once he had mastered his skill after hours and hours of practice over weeks and months, Titanic would take his show public. In doing so, he would sit in the lobby of his hotel or some other public place and start flicking cards at a hat. In doing so, he would purposely miss more often than not, and in doing so, grow visibly frustrated until a quote-unquote stranger laughed at his misfortune and started heckling him. Frustrated and seemingly unable to control himself, Titanic would then bet the heckler $5 that he could get 50 of the 52 cards in the deck into the hat. Invariably, when this happened, one of the others who had gathered to watch this scene would try and get in on the bet, wanting some of this easy money for themselves. Now, initially, Titanic would turn down this interloper, as he insisted that he was only betting against this one man and not the whole town. Eventually, though, the others would start raising the stakes by betting him 2-1 or 5-1 or even 10-1 that he could not in fact get 50 of the 52 cards into the hat. Once the stakes got high enough for his liking, Titanic then had the others put their money on the table, and he'd get down to work. Before doing so, though, Titanic would put on a show of stretching and pacing between his chair and the hat that he was targeting. After looking appropriately nervous and unsure, Titanic would take his seat and begin tossing his cards toward the hat that was sitting on the other side of the room. Typically, then, he would toss one after another into the hat, getting something like 30 in a row in. Yet, just as it looked like he had this in the bag, Titanic would miss one and then another, meaning that to win he would have to be perfect with the remaining 20 cards, which he of course was, at which point he would move to collect his winnings. But before doing so, he would make one final offer to those in attendance, double or nothing if he could get all 52 cards in the deck and the hat. Then, if anyone was foolish enough to take this bet, Titanic would sit in his chair and toss all 52 cards across the room into his hat. He'd then claim his winnings, save for the 10% cut he owed the heckler who had helped him get the show started. Titanic's traveling life eventually led him back to Joplin, where this time he stayed away from the Polstons and their daughter. That being said, he would find another young woman in town who caught his attention. Nora, the 17-year-old chambermaid who worked at the boarding house Titanic was staying at, more often than not apparently, rather than making the young gambler's bet, instead shared it with him. This Joplin relationship would be quite different from his last one, as instead of leaving the young woman behind as he fled the town, Titanic would marry young Nora. That being said, this does not seem to have been a good match at all. To begin with, Nora thought that now that they were married, Alvin would actually leave behind his days of being a traveling gambler, and instead settle down with her. However, settling down and working a normal job was the last thing on Titanic's mind. Instead, it wasn't long after they were married that his wandering feet started to itch again, especially since he had his sights set on a big money opportunity in Kansas City. You see, a man by the name of Locke Renfro, the Missouri checkers champion for several years running, was so confident in his skills that he had a standing public bet of $10,000 that he could beat any challenger. Now, it's at this point that you may note that at no point so far have I discussed checkers as being one of Titanic's games. He was an expert at cards and dice and more than a fair pool player, and he'd also mastered any number of little tricks like tossing cards to lure people into making ill-advised bets, but he had never turned his mind towards checkers. So, why, you may ask, did he think he could beat this champion who had taken down any and all comers in his state? Well, as was the case more often than not with Titanic, he had a plan to shift the odds in his favor. Now, none of Titanic's normal cheats would work in such a situation, but he would still have the proverbial ace up his sleeve for this match. You see, while Locke Renfro might have been the Missouri checkers champion, Harry Lieberman out of Detroit was the champion of the United States. Titanic then would approach Harry and offer him a 50% split of the winnings if he assisted in this scheme. Lieberman then agreed to help, as there was no way Renfro would ever agree to play a $10,000 game against the reigning US champ. By that same token, though, there was no way that Renfro would ever accept the outcome of a game where Lieberman was in the same room telling the unskilled Titanic what moves to make. So instead they positioned Lieberman in the room above where the game was to be played, and then drilled a hole in the floor above the table where the game would take place so he could see the board. As for how he would communicate to the gambler what moves he should make, they relied upon a device whose wire ran down from the room into the basement and then up through the floor by Titanic's foot. As the game got started then, whenever it was his turn, Titanic would seemingly take quite some time considering each of his pieces and what move to make. On the surface, this made the challenger look unsure and contemplative, which made the fact that he always made the right move seem that much more unlikely. This was because what was really happening as Titanic was considering his pieces and his moves. Lieberman, using the device in his room, would send a shock down to Titanic every time he considered the wrong one. It was only when Titanic failed to receive a shock that he knew that he had picked the right piece and the right move. With such help, then, it was only a matter of time before Titanic won the game and split the $10,000 prize with his partner upstairs. In addition to the unfortunate Mr. Renfro, as it turns out, Kansas City was the home of quite a few gamblers, and so Titanic decided to stick around for a while as he worked to separate them from their money. Meanwhile, Nora was back home in Joplin missing her husband. Nora, you see, reportedly took pride in the fact that she was a good homemaker, yet the man she had married did not seem to care about that. Indeed, it often did not seem like he cared about her at all. Sure, her husband didn't smoke or drink or apparently even consider abusing her, which was something of an exception in those days. And he also had a habit of leaving sizable amounts of money around the house for her to discover as a surprise. Yet still, none of this changed the fact that he would be away from home for long stretches without any communication, only to return home unannounced one day and expect to hop into bed together. Behavior that only made the rumors that he was sleeping around while on the road seem all that more believable. Indeed, as it turns out, those rumors were quite true, as Titanic was apparently of the mind that it wasn't cheating if it didn't happen in the same town. From his perspective, as long as he was faithful while in Joplin, he was a good husband. Nora, however, disagreed, and indeed, when she found out for sure that her husband was cheating on her, they divorced. Titanic, though, wouldn't be alone for long, as upon visiting Pittsburgh, he not only found a bustling city fueled by the steel industry, but also a particularly pretty young pickpocket who reportedly tried to make off with his billfold. The problem was Titanic wasn't your typical Mark, who would not notice a young woman's deft touch, as she had barely seized a hold of the sizable billfold before the man she was trying to rob seized a hold of her wrist. Now, the pickpocket, who was wearing a schoolgirl's uniform at the time, tried to fight back, but the man held fast, warning her that if she kept up like this, they could go have a chat with a police officer who was just across the street. This seemed to calm the pickpocket down, as did the amount of money the man showed her that he was carrying around, since in a time when the average working man earned $500 a year, this man seemed to be carrying what looked to be $10,000 worth of $100 bills in his pocket. The money was impressive, as were his tales of being a traveling gambler. The young pickpocket was so impressed that once they were a fair distance away from the cop and he released her arm, she decided to stick around with this strange man for a while yet, as she introduced herself as Alice. The pair then traveled around Pittsburgh together, with Alice confessing that the reason why she was dressed as a schoolgirl was because she was actually a schoolgirl, just one who liked to skip class to pick pockets. Alice, then like Nora before her, was just 17 years old. You may begin to notice a trend here. The two then spent the day together before Titanic escorted Alice back to her parents' home, where he introduced himself to them as a traveling salesman. The following day, when Titanic rose, as he typically did around noon, he was surprised to find Alice sitting in the hotel lobby just waiting for him. Now, he had never told her where he was staying, but she had figured with a bankroll like the one she had tried to lift off him yesterday, Titanic had to be staying in the best hotel in town. The two then went out to lunch and then to the movies. These and similar scenes would play out over the following month or so, as the gambler was apparently quite taken with the young pickpocket, as he escorted her around town and drove her around in his Packard automobile. As they got to know one another, Alice was seemingly a much better fit for Titanic than Nora had been, as in addition to being a pickpocket, she also knew how to drive and knew her guns. Indeed, she would disapprove of his Kraut gun, as she called the Luger, that Titanic carried around for protection. For his part, upon receiving this reprimand of sorts, Titanic quickly went out and purchased a Colt 45 that was much more to her liking. Now, the reason for Alice's disapproval of the Luger and the reason why she called it a Kraut gun was because the year was 1917, which means the Great War in Europe, where Germany was the aggressor, had been raging for some 3 years at this point, and the US was about to join the fight against them. Indeed, this conflict may in some ways explain why the 25-year-old Titanic was so eager to get married again, even after his first marriage seemed to illustrate that he wasn't really fit for such a union. Now, it's unclear for her that single men were more likely to get drafted before married men played any role in his decision. Regardless, though, after just a month of courting, which included buying her a large diamond ring and a house of her own a little ways away from her parents' abode, the 25-year-old gambler would wed the 17-year-old schoolgirl and pickpocket. Now, Alice, unlike Nora, had no plans of changing her husband. Indeed, she seemed to want to join his world, as she had Titanic teach her some of his tricks. Yet when she suggested that she could join him, he insisted that the road was no place for a woman. So when 6 months into their marriage Titanic felt the need to hit the road again, Alice did not try to stop him. She had known who she was marrying and seemed to accept it to some extent. During this trip, Titanic would pull off what I would call one of the most smart-ass grifts I've ever heard of. Things got started when, in 1918, Titanic spent a week in the resort town of French Lake Springs. During his time there, the traveling gambler would learn that one of his fellow guests at the hotel was a prizefighter, a cocky young boxer who was apparently so flush with cash that he wasn't afraid to flaunt it, as he would regularly tip the staff with $10 bills without even looking at them. Titanic then decided he was going to take the cocky young man down a peg or two, when one day he stepped right in the boxer's path, blocking his progress, proclaiming as he did that the other man wasn't so tough. Indeed, the tall, thin man went on to insist that he'd bet $1,000 that the supposedly tough prizefighter couldn't knock him down if they were standing on the same newspaper. Confident as ever, the boxer took the bet. If this man wanted to pay for the privilege of getting knocked out by a pro boxer, who was he to argue? Titanic wasn't done, though, as he invited the others in the lobby to join in, as he got them to also make side bets on this unexpected piece of action. Then, once everyone had put their money in, with most if not all betting on the boxer, Titanic obtained a copy of the local newspaper. The gambler then laid the paper down on the floor in a position of his choosing, while inviting his opponent to stand on one of its pages. Titanic then took up his position on the opposite page, so he was essentially standing nose to nose with a man who made his living punching other men in the face and knocking them out. The thing was, while Titanic had agreed that they would both be standing on the same newspaper, he had failed to inform his opponent or anyone else that his intention was to place said newspaper across a doorway in between two rooms in the hotel, so that while they were standing on the same piece of paper, they were also standing in separate rooms. So, while yes, Titanic would be standing just inches away from a man who could have easily knocked him off his feet with one punch, the boxer wasn't able to actually lay a hand upon him after the traveling gambler closed the door that was separating the two rooms they were in. The boxer nor any of the others then ever had a chance. Now, again, like the vast majority of these stories, I can't tell you with any real certainty that this happened, but I hope that this one, more than any of the others, is actually true. It was also reportedly around this time that as Titanic was driving out of French Lick in his Packard, several $1,000s richer than when he had arrived, he would be passed by a Pierce Arrow, a luxury car that was significantly nicer, significantly more powerful, and significantly more expensive than his own automobile. Titanic was so impressed by this vehicle that, much like the Model T that had passed him years before, or the fancy fishing pole he had seen those city folk walking around with in his youth, he decided that he was going to own one of these fancy cars. That would have to wait, though, as Titanic's road life was about to hit a bit of a bump, as the draft, despite his marital status, still came for him. Indeed, it was a week after his first anniversary, one where he reportedly gave Alice a $100 bill upon being informed that it was a paper anniversary, that Titanic would be drafted into the military. Alvin/Titanic would go through basic training, after which time he was made a sergeant and given the responsibility of putting raw recruits through their paces. While Titanic would go by the book when it came to their daily drills, the sergeant's nightly activities were unlikely to have met with military approval, as that was when he trained his men on how to